This is George Lucas, and welcome to the audio commentary. This really is conceived as a 6-part movie, of which episode 1 is the first chapter, and sometimes it's difficult to keep that in mind, that each film, while it's important in itself and relates to what's going on in that film and has to be entertaining in itself, really is fitting into a larger mosaic, and that the whole enterprise won't really be understood, I think, until you can actually sit down and watch all 6 episodes and then follow the story, because we're dealing in micro stories here. The larger picture is kind of a different story.
God, I'll never forget the first time I sat in a theater with George Lucas and we saw the opening credits. It was a very moving experience for me, working on my first episode with all the history that went with it and all the responsibility. Was a major event for me personally.
I remember the very first roll-up they filmed at ILM on the first movie. The typing was actually set out on the floor, and the camera on a track actually did a huge crane shot over the backlit words. It was not done by computer as it's done today, and I can remember the difficulty they had getting it to move smoothly. And the roll-up would start fast, then go slow, then speed up again, then go slow, and it was impossible to watch at that point until they worked it out and had it all of uniform speed.
Structurally, all the movies start exactly the same way, go from titles, pan down to a ship or to a planet or to something. But we have a fairly stringent stylistic design to these things, so they all work exactly the same. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue.
All the ships in this scene here, the Neimoidian battleships and the blockade, are still photos mapped onto cards.
Most of the sounds in a film like this are not electronic in nature, but rather they're acoustic. They're real sounds that come from the world around us, things that I might hear in everyday life. And it's these everyday ordinary sounds, carefully chosen and orchestrated, which give the film its credibility.
The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this is a thematic note that continues through all the movies. It's a kind of jokey one, but there's a lot more that are more on the serious side. But it really is designed as a piece of music where you have a melodic, thematic device that is used over and over again.
In a film like this, because of production noises on the set and the inappropriate surfaces they may walk on that might the footsteps might have a wooden sound, the original tracks are pretty much thrown away, and about 85% of the dialogue is replaced later after the film has been edited. The actors are brought back in and they do their lines over again while listening to the cue track from the original shooting session. At one point, I dubbed the 2 Neimoidians with ESPN sports announcers. It was kind of a very funny juxtaposition of that kind of voice with their alien characters. It didn't work, but it was funny. It was one of the many experiments used to develop the Neimoidian voices.
These kind of scenes on this particular film on the bridge were kind of interesting. It's the first time we actually shot with no set, and it was very interesting to try to figure out how we were going to put all this together, because all I really had was the 2 Neimoidians there and a door, and everything else was done in blue screen or in miniature.
The motors you hear on the robot here, which are the same motors used in C-3PO, are actually from a 1969 Cadillac Eldorado door motor, the motor used for the windows to go up and down.
Again, I wanted the recurring theme of the protocol droid. I wanted to make sure people realized it wasn't 3PO, but that we always have protocol droids in the movies to remind you of 3PO's crew role in all this. Introducing Darth Sidious as a hologram was the way he was introduced actually in Empire Strikes Back, which is the first time we actually saw him in the first 3 films. So I thought it appropriate to keep that thematic device going, is only know him as a hologram and not to actually deal with him, except in one small scene as a real person, because I did want to make sure that you knew that he wasn't just a hologram, make him sort of flesh and blood.
One of the interesting things about this scene is it contains one of the only non-visual effect shots that we have in the whole movie, and I'll give you a clue. It's the ventilation shaft. And we actually did that at ILM. about a year and a half after we shot the actual sequence.
We have the attack of the droids here. It was important to establish these droids as slightly goofy rather than ominous, and not very good shots. And they have absolutely no defense against a Jedi and a laser sword. They're just hopeless. So the idea was that as we go on, that the problem of developing better combat technology is established in this movie, and then it will be dealt with further in Episode 2. Failings of a robotic army in terms of their all being controlled by one source and not being as swift as a human is a theme that we play out through all the movies. It was very important in the beginning here of the film to establish that the Jedi were invincible. Kind of reverse the classic monster coming through the door motif, where you and make it where the aliens and the droids and all the villains are faced with these two sort of invincible creatures, Jedi Godzillas that nothing can stop. I kind of enjoyed the idea of making the good guys invincible and the bad guys cowering in fear. They have to obviously come up against some force that drives them off the ship, and we use the wheel droids to do that.
Master, destroyer!
The lasers for the wheel droids, you may notice there's a sound. It sounds like a horn beeping in there, but it was actually a sound recorded during Empire Strikes Back. There was an air gun on the set which fired bits of metal through the air when Darth Vader and Luke were fighting in the carbon freezing chamber. And that special effects gun on the set made kind of a sound like a little horn. And I took the very beginnings of that sound and used it to make the lasers for the wheel droids. So sounds get recycled. Some things recorded 20 years ago, if they haven't been used yet, they often get listened to again as we search for components for the usually something of the nature of 1,000 recording projects for the sound effects in each film.
This movie is told primarily from the Jedi's point of view, but the story that's being told is essentially the story of Queen Amidala and her plight of having her planet blockaded, as in, say, Episode 4, where the story is told through the eyes of the droids, and this one is told through the eyes of the Jedi.
Sound of her view screen tuning was a kind of a fun homage. There was a sound I loved as a kid in the old Flash Gordon serials for the view screens being tuned. I could never figure out what that sound was. It had kind of an electronic tone to it. Of course, I knew in the early 1930s they didn't have the ability to generate a sound effect that way. And I thought about it a lot, and eventually I reasoned that it must have been a musical instrument. And a bit of research turned up a flute, which Gary Rydstrom's wife, Cindy, can play.
She's right.
And I got her to play her flute exactly the same note as we heard in those old movies. And I was really surprised to find out that it was exactly the sound I was looking for.
This particular shot represented a turning point for everyone working at ILM and everyone in the post-production editorial process. It was such a beautiful, breathtaking painting, and it was the first time that all of us could actually see the depth and wealth of talent that was going into a shot. It was monumental to be able to see something so provocative and so beautiful as Naboo like that, because we had been working for so long and so hard, and we had not really seen a painting that had come out of ILM for a long time.
When I decided to create the planet of Naboo, I really wanted to create a planet that was timeless, but at the same time reminiscent of classic Roman Renaissance architecture. So we shot in Italy and used a lot of Italian influences in this to create an environment that was not based on technology, but based on beauty and a whole different mindset from the more technological cultures like Coruscant.
These ships, the sound of these ships were fashioned from a helicopter. The sound of an idling helicopter slowed down a great deal. Had some nice tone qualities to it, as well as a deep rhythmic sound.
This is a very large model we built, probably about 5 feet long, that is shot against the blue screen that's going behind these trees. These trees, I think, are a photograph we actually had taken during the making of Star Wars that we used for the background of that shot. And even some of these backgrounds here were slides that we had taken during the first Star Wars that we're reusing. These are, this is the big landing sequence where we just tried to make it as big as we could with all sorts of interesting looking vehicles coming out and different scale creatures and this sort of like moody kind of hidden look. It was hard figuring out the logic of this because they're massive ships and massive transport vehicles, yet they're supposed to be hiding in the forest. So we eventually came up with the idea of they're kind of in this small clearing, and that's what you kind of see there.
One of the challenges in doing a movie like this is that you want to have simultaneity in terms of the storytelling, in terms of establishing an environment, moving the plot along, and then making each shot or scene interesting in itself. We're establishing the flora and fauna and the environment, the threat of the Trade Federation, and then what we're really doing in this scene is introducing a new character, which becomes a key character later on. The challenge always in writing scenes like this is you got to try to get all these things to happen at once in the same scene. You can't just have a scene that does one thing, like, say, establish a character. You also have to keep the plot moving and the fact that this attack is going on, and you also have to begin to introduce people into this environment, into this planet.
Here's a scene that's straight out of Star Wars. We've got the speeder bikes going and shooting, something like the speeder bikes, and the laser swords are being fought, and the explosions are going off. And when John Noel saw that, he said, "Looks like it's out of the Star Wars films." And I said, "Yeah, that's the idea."
More did you speak?
This is actually one of my favorite scenes, especially in terms of Jar Jar. I mean, this is the scene where we really were able to take a digital character and make him photorealistic and have him interact with the live actors in a way that seemed believable. It's one of the first scenes we actually did, and I still think it's one of the best.
No. He's embarrassed.
With computer graphics, you want to make sure that it has all the weight and believability of a real object moving through a three-dimensional space, because you're looking at Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor, and you're able to instantaneously compare Jar Jar's physicality to the human's physicality.
These were particularly hard shots, these shots of Jar Jar standing there, again, marrying him into the background and getting the leaf effects on his head, so you get the sunlight and the shadowing on him. And here everybody is sort of a little on the moist side because it must have been pretty warm out there when they shot it, so we have Jar Jar even a little perspiring like the actors are.
I always find it pleasing that about 10 minutes into the film, we have a quiet scene. The way these films are designed, they often start out with a chase, but it's also very good then to pull back somewhere early in the movie and have a section of things that are very quiet without music.
The thing that got me interested in the show really were these sequences. I remember going up to the ranch and George showed me the artwork that had been done for it and described it. I'm just thinking, that sounds really great. I really want to work on the show.
This is, again, one of these amazing shots that just sent shudders throughout the whole screening room when we were all sitting watching it. It was one of the first shots that Dennis Muren delivered, and it was so complicated, so difficult to do. Everybody was so frustrated after weeks and weeks of trying to get this shot right, and then to finally see it in all its kind of breathtaking glory was just a real pivotal point for all of us.
One of the trickiest things in the Star Wars saga is to come up with new environments. Each film has 3 or 4 new environments, and it's a struggle in each film to sort of come up with something that you can use to tell the story with and isn't so bizarre or out there that you can't, it doesn't fit into the context of the universe I've created. But at the same time, gives you a different visual experience in each movie.
Here you can see the Gungans are wary of the Jedi and they move away. Tarpelson comes in and we find out that Jar Jar's in trouble. Directing Jar Jar was a challenge because I had about 15 animators animating him at any given time, although the direction remains the same, which is Jar Jar's confused in this scene, doesn't know what's going on, or Jar Jar's trying to be helpful and doesn't know what he's doing. If you think of 15 different people, they each bring a slightly different bit of themselves to the character. And as a director, you need to make sure that you're pulling one cohesive performance out of them. Same thing here with Boss Nass. I had a much smaller team working on the boss, about 5 animators working on him in total. The thought there was that you wouldn't want to have to teach an entire team. I had about 45 animators working with me. You don't want to teach every single animator every single character. There's going to be people who are stronger at dialogue and people are stronger at action or performance. And you try and cast your animators like you would cast your actors or your voice talent.
Once those droids take control of the surface, they will take control of you.
Me shall not think so.
Some of the sets, the background sets that you're seeing here, that the CG characters are standing on, are models. Not very big. I think the whole miniature set was probably only about 4 or 5 feet across, and shot against blue, and then all the bubbles in the background are computer graphic generated and put it back there to look like they're far, far in the distance. See all the fish swimming around there? I think you're seeing the same few fish over and over and over again. But we make them dark, we make them light, we have them going to the left and right and left, have them go a little faster and slower, and you really can't tell the difference. And it fills the frame up. It gives you a good sense of being, of having water out there, which is what we had to accomplish. In the design for this set, from our point of view, because we were creating all the ribbing and everything that you see, we sort of had to figure out, well, what was it made out of? Is it manufactured by them? Is it built in some way? And what we came up with is it was actually grown, which is why everything is sort of in curves and all. It looks very organic, that they would have found some way to have grown this building. And within it, then they can have their air, but, they can be grown like on the bottom of the ocean, and then they can go in them and occupy them and use them.
One of the thematic devices here is that these two cultures come together and join forces and become friends and are treated as equals. Where in the beginning of the film, they basically don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to have anything to do with each other. Each one is a sort of insular society. This is one of my favorite scenes because all digital characters, except for the two humans, I think it came off very well in terms of the characters and the humor. And you just don't get this strong sense that you're in an animated film. You feel you're in a real place. In essence, you're watching, Roger Rabbit in Toonville. It just doesn't look like it.
Here's the sub coming out of one of the membranes. This was a computer graphic sub, all computer graphic city here. And this is a design of a shot that I used to do even back in Empire Strikes Back, starting with, in that case, it was the Falcon close to the camera flying off in the distance through the asteroid field. And I just really like doing those shots in profile. And I did manage to get one into this show, too, with the sub close to the camera and flying off in the distance and then going down into this canyon down here.
Here's one of our creatures attached to the stalactite. He now swims down after him. He was also an interesting design. So we've got crustacean legs with then fins up in the front, and this very strange tongue that we're going to see here in a little bit.
The backgrounds here of the rocks were all shot as models, and then the creatures in the sub are CG and all the particles and all floating around. This was a difficult sequence to visualize how we could show everything, how you could show the tongue coming out in the cut and then being pulled into his mouth, and this part right here. This series of about 5 or 6 shots, we worked really extensively in the design of them so that the audience could understand it. And then even here, when we've got a big creature like that, how do we show something even bigger? And we did that with this final large creature here, really fading him way off in the distance. He's so far away from camera because he's so big, you can hardly even see him very well. And that was all very intentional to make him look huge and massive, to go with the line, there's always a bigger fish.
Part of the issue of cutting back to the Trade Federation is to keep the plot moving, but also to get this strand of the movie constantly being reminded that there are the bad guys out there, that the Trade Federation is trying to track them down, and keep the threat alive so you don't forget what the issues are, because our heroes are go for long periods of time without coming in contact with the bad guys.
The question came up in this scene, what to do about the door, since it had been damaged in the previous scene. So we decided just to have it open, as though it had been removed to be repaired or a new piece had been brought in.
Where is it going?
The middle creature, which they're about to approach right now, we call the Kolos creature. I don't know why that's named that way, but it is. And to give it some sort of justification, we sort of came up with the idea that it's like a mother, and it's in its cave here, and its babies have been hatched. And if you kind of look in the background here, you'll see them sort of crawling up a wall. There's one on the upper right going up a wall there, and you don't know that yet, but there are these things around them, and that's what's scaring Jar Jar. And when they finally turn the lighting on and the headlights on the ship here, it blasts right in the eyes of the mom, who's been sort of sleeping there, and wakes her up. And of course, she thinks that her young are being attacked, and so she attacks this intruder and goes after him to protect the young.
This underwater sequence is full of spooks coming out of the closet and other cheap tricks, which are always fun to do in a movie. Every time they turn around, they come into a kind of a more difficult situation with adversaries, and so it kind of compounds itself.
This was a difficult sequence to sort of pre-visualize with all the different angles that we had to do. So we spent a lot of time doing animatics on this sequence to be able to figure out and for the audience to figure out how the cutting would work, where everybody was looking, how big this creature was, how small that creature was, etc. This was a massive CG shot. We actually did, I think, over a period of about 4 months working on that one shot.
The shot was a challenge when we designed it, because it's the first time we actually see the entire army, and it's followed by this sequence where we see the entire town. Because, these are completely digital shots. There's no reality to it at all. And trying to make those look real so that, it looks like it fits into a live-action movie was a real challenge. And now we've got this, I think we accomplished that in terms of making making all these completely synthetic shots, like this one where the sub comes out of the water, look realistic enough to believe that these people are actually in this place. It was a real challenge in the beginning to think that we were going to be doing movies where, at least half of the environments were created digitally in a computer, and there just wasn't going to be anything real there at all. And a lot of these sequences are like that. And then they have to be holed up, so you can intercut them with sequences like this coming down the stairs, which is shot in an Italian palace, and then be able to cut to a totally digital environment as they come down the stairs outside the palace. The only thing we had in this shot here, coming out of the palace, was really them walking down a set of stairs. And everything else is fake. I mean, fake in terms of the fact that it's digital.
Many of these scenes were shot with very little background. And as we pan across these windows and things, everything outside was added later. So this included quite an extensive amount of rotoing and manipulation of the background. So this is part of the real set. And then the shot where he jumps down is actually made up of like 5 different pieces of film. So here we have the animated droids, putting in the lightsaber and all the interactive effects and sparks and things to try it. Tie it all together.
A lot of the times when we had the droids breaking apart and falling apart, we used a rigid body simulator that we'd created here at ILM to help get that realistic feeling of the bodies hitting the ground and bouncing off the walls.
I tend to use, in some cases, a rather abstract way of telling a story, and then I use montage editing throughout the scenes. We'll get into a dialogue scene, but when you get into an action scene, I will separate things off and not show the beginnings and ends of things, but sometimes just the middles, which gives you the sense of what's going on without the continuity of how it's actually happening. And you'll see that in a lot of these action set pieces. And then overall, on the grander scale, I do it in terms of intercutting different ideas. In terms of like the Nemoidians, we jump quite a bit. I'm going to take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's the style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. Visuals are music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing.
The scene where they escape from Naboo, this was the first scene that I encountered during the pre-visualization process where we had to actually have fighting battle droids. No one was quite sure how the battle droids would behave, how quickly they might move, how agile they'd be, what their body language would be. I had the fun of going down to ILM and putting on a motion capture suit. And I was able to act like a battle droid in the middle of this empty studio. And all of my movements were recorded by the computers. And then those movements were applied to a model of the battle droid in the computer. So what I got back was a videotape of a battle droid which walked and acted and stood and moved like I did. In fact, I was a little embarrassed at first because I recognized my kind of duck walk.
Even though he motion captured himself, the battle droid's rear end got rotated in such a way that it looked like it had a little back end of a duck, and George ended up liking it. So when we went to do the motion capture with the optical system, which is a lot cleaner, we emulated the duck walk and applied it to the character.
This is a scene where we introduce R2, which was a fun moment for me, but since R2 becomes a central character throughout the movie. One of the things we're doing in this movie is to introduce characters and see where they came from. The main job of the first episode really is to introduce characters. It's what the first act of a play is all about. Set up the plot and introduce the characters. And so in the whole Star Wars saga, this will be the first time that R2 is introduced. So I wanted to give him a little bit of a dramatic opening, chance to do something, be a little hero. He is a hero throughout the series. He's always the one that sort of comes through in the end and saves the day. So I thought it was appropriate at this point when we do introduce him, that we introduce him in a bit of an action sequence where he can again establish his character as a hero, because that continues through the whole series. And I chose R2 to be the one that was introduced first. I guess I gave him the priority because, I don't know, I guess I'm partial to him. Don't tell 3PO that. He'll get upset.
Power's back!
During that escape sequence, there used to be a whole sequence going on simultaneously below decks of Jar Jar Binks interacting in a comical way with a hold full of R2 units. While the ship was spinning and dodging back and forth amongst the lasers, Jar Jar was downstairs being thrown from side to side, bumping into droids in kind of a large slapstick sequence, which actually it was all filmed and it worked pretty well, but one has to make choices in the end as an editor as to what will further the story and what will just delay the advance of the story. Some things that may work well on their own will be dispensed with later on during the editing process in favor of telling the whole story in a smooth fashion.
We landed on a system controlled by the Federation.
So not only are we able to introduce R2 in this particular moment with that action set piece, but at the same time I'm able to twist the story in a way that's necessary, because obviously I have to get them to Tatooine in order to meet Anakin, which is again part of the story, and I used that device of introducing R2 and at the same time damaging the ship so we could get to where we needed to go.
My lord,
as we come back to the Trade Federation, every time I try to introduce a new element of danger, a new threat. In this one, I introduced Darth Maul, and at the same time move the plot along on the fact that he wants to have her sign a treaty, which is the basis of the whole plot of the movie, which is they're trying to get her to turn over her planet to the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation is working on one level of greed, wanting to take over this planet, which Darth Sidious is manipulating, because in the end, his agenda is completely different. He's just simply using the Trade Federation, using the Jedi, using the Queen for his own purpose. He's the puppet master in all these movies. His goal in this one, the whole plot of the movie really, is for Palpatine to become Chancellor. This whole thing is a large bunch of machinations to allow Palpatine to ascend to the highest office in the galaxy.
Padme.
We have some shots in the Queen ship that look like standard live-action shots, but once again, we actually did quite a bit of work here. George didn't like the timing, and they also had some problems with R2-D2, so we had to slice his head and move his head around and change the sync on that. And that included changing the shadows and all the other little interactions on him. Then we also had scenes where one of the people would walk out, and she'd have reflections where she shouldn't. And in other cases, they had a take that they wanted to use, but the girl was still standing there, so we had to remove her out of that scene. So here she is cleaning up, and this was one of the first Jar Jar shots our team worked on. Rob can probably talk about some of the animation issues here.
For every Jar Jar shot in the movie, we had Ahmed Best on set, who did a walkthrough and did performance reference for us and with the actors, so that they knew the timing of where they were looking and when they were talking. This shot here is one of the most difficult Jar Jar shots we did in the movie, simply because of his interaction with the set and with the environment around him.
Making the Queen ship show up in space was always a challenge, because it's 100% reflective, and in space there's very little to reflect. So we were always cheating how much of it you see.
Watch the dust come up from this.
The dust in the shot is actually a stage element that we shot. Everything else in the shot is computer generated. The background was pasted together from some photographs I took in Tunisia.
The hyperdrive generator's gone, Master. We'll need a new one.
That'll complicate things. Be wary.
Most people prefer to shoot on stages, but I actually personally prefer shooting on location because you never know exactly what's going to happen. The night before we left Italy, Natalie had woken up in the middle of the night and fallen out of her bed and had twisted her ankle. You'll notice in this shot, she's kind of limping, and she limps basically throughout this whole next 2-week period that we shot in Tunisia.
Her Highness commands you to take her handmaiden with you.
You can see in the background that the sky is not blue. It's actually slightly dark. Well, that was going to be something that would haunt us for the rest of the time that we were in Tunisia. We had a horrific storm that night with 100-mile-an-hour winds that virtually destroyed all of our sets in Tunisia.
When we came to Tatooine, I wanted to come to Tatooine, but not come to Mos Eisley, which is where the fourth film took place. I wanted to land on a different city so that we got a different sense of what Tatooine was like, and that there were lots of different cities, and that not have the whole story take place in exactly one spot. We can get onto the same planet, but not have it be in the same city. This is quite a large city as opposed to Mos Eisley, which is a very small city. It was a lot of fun in this one to be able to have a lot of the background characters that we weren't able to do before. You know, little funny creatures and things that I wasn't able to really have in episode 4. Really shows how far the technology has come in terms of allowing me to make Mos Espa look the way I had wanted Mos Eisley to look in the episode 4. You know, to have these kinds of strange alien creatures, which Watto is one of my favorite.
Watto was one of the most fun characters to animate, I have to tell you. He, right from the first, when I read the script and I read the lines that he was going to be delivering with Qui-Gon, it really made me fall in love with this character. He's cranky, he's got an attitude. He clearly cares for Anakin, but he thinks he's a pretty tough businessman. Technically, he gives us some challenges. He's got that big belly and those wings in the background. So we were worried that the audience wouldn't believe that he could actually fly. And we had all kinds of discussions about bumblebees and different birds and what would he look like if he was really flying. George said, well, think of him as he's got some helium in his belly, or that he's, don't think of him as a terrestrial character. He's from a different galaxy. Don't worry about it. So once we've sort of believed in it, then we went along with it, and I think the audience believed in it too.
An angel.
One of the key elements of this and the introduction of Anakin and the development of Anakin in this film is that I wanted him to be a very earnest, very honest, very good-natured person. Just the opposite of the way you think of Darth Vader. Because the larger story is really how does such a sweet kid like this turn into something as evil as Darth Vader. And I didn't want it to have the obvious, well, he grew up, he was a bad kid to begin with, and he just, part of the story is, how does he become bad? What choices does he make to become bad? Not, well, he was bad to begin with, so it's obvious that that's where he was going to go. So the whole character slant on this film with Anakin was to set him up and develop him and have it be a really positive character, so that in the later movies I can have something to do with him. The sequence where Jar Jar chases the little droid around, the reactions of the droid, the animators just brought a whole different level to that relationship than what I'd written and what we directed on the set.
For all of those who really like film trivia, there is a prop in this sequence from 2001.
We have this great scene with Qui-Gon and Watto in the backyard where he goes out and they starts to try and cut the deal. It's at this point that we find out what a Tidarian is, and that Tidarians, of course, aren't affected by Jedi mind tricks, which is such a fantastic idea. I'm so happy that George came up with that. And it was a fun scene to do. You've got this great actor, and you've got this fantastic voice actor coming together for a really enjoyable scene. This actually was one of the first sequences we did, and these are the very first shots that we finalized in the film. I felt that he was a standalone character enough in this sequence that we could chance it doing it very early on production.
One of the sounds which really helps describe a character and describe the space that he's in is the sound of the wings for Watto flapping. And I thought it might be very complicated at first to try to come up with a sound that had the right perspective and would move at just the right speed, but actually it turned out to be fairly simple. I made a recording of an umbrella opening and then closing, and made a loop of it so it would repeat itself over and over again very fast. And eventually I put it on the keyboard of a synthesizer so you could just press a key and you'd have the fluttering of this umbrella opening and closing.
One of the issues with Watto, of course, was that when he was originally designed, he had 4 tusks, 2 top and 2 bottom, and was worried with all his dialogue whether the audience would actually be able to understand him, because if you imagine your mouth full of those huge teeth and that trunk, that it wouldn't be believable. So we decided to chip off one of his teeth. We had him talk out of his left side of his face, and it gave him all this more personality, and I'm really happy that we ended up doing that.
production of a film like this adds up to at least the production of 2 movies. One, a full-length feature film, the other, a full-length animated film. And you get characters like Watto and Jar Jar and others in which you really have to not only write and shoot the movie, but then edit it together, edit the dialogue together, and then turn over that edited dialogue track to the animation department, and they will then create the character and sync its voice to the pre-recorded track.
The sequence that we're moving into here with Jar Jar in the market leads us to another one of our favorite cameo characters, Sebulba. Sebulba was fantastic on so many different levels. Of course, right from the design, having a character that walks in his hands and has that fantastic face. He was a real joy to animate. Here's a favorite scene of many of the animators here at ILM. Sebulba attacking Jar Jar. But it's especially these shots with Sebulba and Anakin facing off that I'm very proud of and very happy to have been associated with. Look at the subtlety in the ears, nostrils, all the dangling parts of him make him look like he's truly in that scene. At one point, Jake sort of moves backwards, and we hit him with the frog at that moment to help tie those two characters together on the screen. I think it's very successful.
There's a backstory here that we're never going to know about between Sebulba and Anakin. The drift of it is that they're sort of rivals and not the best of friends, but you never find out exactly what happened or what was going on. You just get a flavor of what it is, but it really is designed to set up this rivalry that's going to pay off later in the pod race.
Good wind is hard to come by, and of course movie wind has a quality all of its own that you don't often really hear in real life, but I can remember elements of this wind I recorded at Cape Cod, Massachusetts, years ago when there was a storm and the wind was blowing through the screen porch in the front of the cottage at the ocean. And
this scene is designed to let Anakin see Qui-Gon's lightsaber, which again is a plot point. At the same time, trying to make Anakin kind and friendly to all the locals, and then ultimately set up the major plot progression is that they're going to stay with him for a while. Their lives are going to become intermeshed. I saw these little troglodyte storage bins for grain the first time I got a location for episode 4, and I always wanted to use them in the movie. I wanted to use them in episode 4, but there was just no room for them. So when this movie came along, I told Gavin, I said, when you go to Tunisia, go look up these grain storage bins because they're really great, and maybe we can use them for, the slave quarters or something like that. And so I managed to get them back in and, design a whole different kind of living quarter from what I'd had in the first film.
One of the biggest jobs of sound editing in the film is creating and synchronizing all the motors for the robots, most notably R2-D2 and C-3PO, because they have multiple motors, driving motors, arm and head motors.
Obviously, in this shot, this little sequence, we couldn't use Anthony Daniels, but we did have a puppeteer who was attached to this C-3PO, and then we had Anthony Daniels sitting on the left-hand side of the frame doing all of the dialogue.
And here, coming up with the idea that not only is Darth Vader Luke and Leia's father, but he's also 3PO's father. And I thought that was kind of an amusing irony in all of this. And I couldn't resist it. It gives us the opportunity for a 3PO to meet R2 for the first time and start what will ultimately become a very long and arduous friendship of sorts.
In the original script, C-3PO was only in a handful of shots. I think it was only 3 or 4 of them. And one of the shots was C-3PO being turned on and leaning up from the table, swinging his feet out and standing up. So I thought, probably the best way to handle this is, rather than try and build some very complicated computer graphic model that would be very heavy because of all those wires and internal structure, that the best thing would be to have a puppet of some kind that we could operate on the set. And then to be able to have him stand up and take a step forward, what if we attach this puppet to the front of a performer? There's a Japanese theater puppetry technique that does that. So we thought we would use that technique. And that painting out the performer would be a painful and time-consuming process, but that we could suffer through it for the 2 or 3 shots that it needed to be in. Well, after we committed to that technique, George decided that this scene would be longer and that C-3PO would be in this scene and then that scene, and he ended up being in quite a lot of shots. So this painful technique that we came up with, that we thought we'd only have to suffer through a couple of shots on, ended up being many, many shots.
Naboo to sign the treaty.
At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi.
This was the very first shot, the very first day of Episode 1. Very exciting moment for all of us.
A match for you.
This is a fun scene. It was very difficult to shoot because it's a very long scene, a lot of dialogue, and each take that we did was about 10 minutes long. The scene ultimately cut itself down to about, 6 or 8 minutes, I think this is. But it's a very complicated scene, and I tried to play it in its entirety. I didn't break it up into pieces. I actually played it all the way through, which was kind of tough on Jake, because he's only 9, 10 years old, and to remember all that dialogue at a 10-minute scene and be able to go all the way through it without stopping is a challenge for anybody. But he did really well.
Very dangerous.
This is a very tough day. It was very hard for a lot of people, for everybody to concentrate. It was extremely hot in London. But I'll never forget, George came up with the idea of Liam grabbing onto Jar Jar's tongue. And the minute that happened, that just lightened the whole day, and we managed to get through with a great day's work.
From this moment on, Jar Jar has to be quiet. And what happens with computer graphics, and especially some computer graphic animators, mostly the junior ones, if they're so excited to be animating a character in a Star Wars film that they tend to upstage the actors. So trying to get them to make a performance that is believable in that the character's alive and breathing and not locked off, but is not overacting, sometimes it's one of my bigger challenges. I'm pretty happy with the way that this worked out. Jar Jar is a broad character, of course, but he isn't interrupting into the scene at this point.
Fooling you, Anakin. We're on our way to Coruscant.
Dining room scenes, eating scenes are always a little tricky to shoot because of the screen direction and the fact that I've got them basically sitting around the table talking for 10 minutes. You're sort of worried that it's not going to play, especially in something that is, in essence, an action picture. This is nothing but a very long exposition scene. You come up with things like the jokes with Jar Jar and developing his earnest character, which allow you to play this scene out as long as it plays out in order to get all the exposition out that has to be told. Almost every other word out of someone's mouth in this scene is a key expository story that needs to be told in order to understand what's going to happen next. There's a lot of mechanical things going on here. How do they get the pods? How do they get in the race? How are they going to get their engine parts? There's all that stuff comes together and is told in this one scene. You always have a scene like this in a movie. We call it the pointer scene. The classic one is in Indiana Jones when the government agents come and he explains what the Ark of the Covenant is. And he stands there with a pointer and he points at there. And this is how this happens. And they open the book and they look in the book. Well, unfortunately, it's a scene you always have to have in a movie. You have to stick it somewhere. Nobody wants to do it. It's hard to get through because you're afraid it's going to be boring, but it's absolutely essential in terms of telling the story. Magically enough, it's a scene that usually ends up being about a third of the way through the movie. About 30 to 40 minutes into it.
The sound ambience of all the places we go in the Star Wars films is a very critical element of the soundtrack, and a lot of thought and a lot of layering of sounds goes into creating what really is just essentially off-screen. Often I've joked in the Star Wars films about the off-screen movie, and what I refer to is all the sounds that are happening that you don't see the objects that are making the sounds, but nonetheless they're there at some level. A good example would be the streets of Mos Espa, where if you're in Watto's shop or you're out in the streets, you'll hear a different density of traffic noise, overhead spaceships, the wall of the aliens. And you can really give a sense that these places are real when you go from the noisy exterior street into Watto's shop. The sounds will not only drop in level, but will move things off-screen into the surround speakers while we're inside the house. So that although you're hearing a few different sounds in the house, the little sounds of the mechanisms and motors in Watto's shop, you're still hearing occasionally distant pass-bys of speeders and overhead spaceships. And those sounds are not just dropped in arbitrarily. They're timed very precisely to fall in the pauses in between dialogue. Often they can act as little accents of sound at a pause in the action. It's nice You hear for just a moment a little spaceship go by out the door, or you hear a yell from the street outside. And it's those kind of little details that are a lot of fun to add to the soundtrack, and I think they really add up into keeping alive in the audience's mind all the off-screen activities that are happening in this town. And it really is a stylistic element of George Lucas's films to have many things going on at once.
Watto was definitely one of my favorite characters in terms of CG characters that were developed for the film. This scene actually was one of the first scenes we animated. It was really exciting to watch this come together because it's the first time, again, we'd ever really had a fully animated character that we'd had to work with in terms of doing a performance. We'd have dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and that sort of thing, but never a photorealistic actual character, an alien that carried on a 5-minute dialogue scene. It turned out much better than we expected.
Those are 6 or so dewbacks out there. George had asked me to put them into the shot, and I asked him what they were doing. He said they're having lunch. And I said, what are they going to have? Sandwiches? But
I've also developed a style of ending up with different people in different places. Something like an American Graffiti, where we cut 4 completely different stories, intercut them. I like and tend toward having a lot of characters and then intercutting all the characters and their stories going on simultaneously. Especially when we get down toward the end of the movie. The last reel is always a lot of different people in different places interacting, which gives you a lot of editorial dynamics and challenges in terms of being able to keep track of everything and everybody. This is a hotel just like the grain cellars. This grain cellars that were turned into a hotel that I visited the first time I ever went to Tunisia, and said to myself, someday I'm going to put this in a movie, and try to get it into Episode 4, A New Hope, but was never able to do it, so we trekked out in the middle of nowhere to shoot this scene.
I think there's a factor in all of these films that you kind of weigh with each scene of the movie. The factor is one of giving life to the scene. And sometimes giving life to the scene means very quiet, very soft, very subtle sounds, but just enough to keep alive the environment that the characters are in. Other times, of course, the sound will be very busy to keep a proportionate life going. But it's the contrast of loud and soft and the contrast of dense and thin, which follows a dramatic curve in the film.
I wanted to get that sense in the movie that a certain environment that I grew up, which is, the old battered car sitting in the backyard that you work on, or somebody's working on, year after year after year, and it never really goes anywhere. But a friend of mine's father had a car like this. It was sitting in his garage, and every weekend he'd work on that car. And he did it, for as long as I was living in Modesto. It was like 20 years. And I don't think he ever finished it. But I think it's something I feel very nostalgic about.
It's a fun bit of overacting Jar Jar coming up here. George wanted his tongue to get all numb so that he would speak in an even more stranger way than he normally does. But it was a great excuse to do some fun animation. Intercut, actually, in here are some of Ahmed in the suit. This is actually Ahmed's hand reaching down, cut with a completely CG Jar Jar. Kevin Martell did some beautiful animation in here with Jar Jar's loose tongue. Once again, Ahmed's hand, CG, real, CG. Having Ahmed in a suit that was representative of Jar Jar's skin texture really helped out the technical directors in terms of lighting Jar Jar convincingly in each scene. We also knew that there were a number of shots like those hand shots where we'd be able to get away with the suit and wouldn't have to animate a digital character.
Finding this simple little scene, for a lot of younger kids, they find it almost intolerable to watch. Having his hand sitting in the fan of the car and the kid about to start the car up. It's amazing how different age groups find different levels of tension or enjoyment.
There's a tight bit of interaction between Padme and Jar Jar. I think it works pretty well, but it's very difficult to get the two of them to interact. She rehearsed it with Ahmed, and then we tried to use the plate that he was not in, and ended up painting him out and using that one because it had better interaction.
This is a sequence that we shot about 13 months after principal photography, and we were really worried about it because Jake had grown about 4 inches, but I think we were just able to pull it off. You don't really see the difference too much in how much he had grown.
In the original script, didn't have this scene, but I really wanted to get a sense of Anakin's future and Anakin's dreams and where he expected to go. And I thought I needed this little introspective moment. The plot device in this is that he has to get the blood sample in order to figure out the midichlorian count. But before we did it in a garage. But I took it out of the garage, rewrote it, and put it on the balcony at night so we could talk about the stars and going to the stars and that sort of thing.
I need an analysis of this blood sample I'm sending you.
Wait a minute.
Bringing midichlorians into it as a device is something that existed from the beginning, but I would never really had the time to go into any explanation, because every time these rather larger concepts come into play, how does the galaxy work, what is the Force, all this kind of stuff, you have to be very sort of cryptic and deal in almost fortune cookie descriptions of things, and so it's very difficult to get a concept across. But I figured in this whole movie I could begin to bring out the idea of midichlorians and their job in being sensitive to the Force, and why some people are more susceptible to the Force than others, which is an issue that's in the first film, but you never know why some people have the Force is stronger with some people and not strong with other people. What is the device that causes that to happen? And I also like the idea of this symbiotic relationships, which is and again an ongoing theme in the whole movie of people helping people, that there may be a completely different race of life form that lives inside your body, completely independent of you, but has some influence over you.
This is all actually shot during the daytime. Originally this took place at sunset, but George decided to make it early evening. First of our big pod race arena shots. There's a lot of CG people in the background, as well as a lot of blue screen extras in the foreground. CG creatures are all over the place here.
Yeah, we have the obvious Watto and Jar Jar and Sebulba, but though, of course, if you look in the background, we've got a lot of droids, and then we'll go in the reverse of this angle. We've got big creatures in the background. We've got Rontos and Dewbacks.
You don't think Anakin can win?
Don't get me wrong, though.
All the views in this direction are a miniature.
Is it credit to your race?
And the views in this direction are of a section of the set that we had full size. But it was only that one wall. So these views this direction are all the miniature.
Why do you think that?
He always wins.
And then this is actually a split. The part of the set that's on the right-hand side of frame is the live-action set, and the part on the left is a miniature.
I'll wager my new racing.
So to populate the background, those are lots of blue screen elements of individual people added in to fill it up and make it busy.
The boy, then.
Well,
I was always pleased with this animation on Watto. A lot of this was done by Steve Rollins, a great character animator here. And Tim Harrington, Linda Bell, Sue Campbell, they all did a fantastic job in this section.
it's the boy. Red.
What makes that look work is because of the follow-through of the skin underneath his chin, I think, and the way his trunk moves. That you have a feeling of that head snapping around, but there's a follow-through of what we call an animation, a secondary movement. As animators, that doesn't naturally happen inside the computer, though. So you have to be thinking about that when you're making that character move.
There's a shot coming up here of Padme on the Eope, and it's this one right here that was shot a year after principal photography. So the really remarkable difference is that that's Jake a year later as well. So when you're 8 years old, a year makes a big difference in your look.
This was a fun shot because we made it up. It had no pan in the original shot. You didn't pan over to R2 and 3PO. But we were able to create that digitally, take a regular shot and just move it and turn it into a pan, and then add the part with 3PO and R2. Just the beginnings of learning how to create really 3D worlds using 2D images, where you shot something but you want to continue it, but you didn't do it because it wasn't there.
Kitster's right. I will this time.
Of course you will.
Computer-generated probe droid. Spaceman was added there later. Okay, big pod race stadium. There's everything in this shot. It's a big miniature. All of the pods are in there, so all 18 of them. There's computer-generated people out on the ground going up and down the steps. There's creatures everywhere.
The original cut of this grid sequence was quite long. We just kept cutting it down and down because it sort of got out of proportion with the rest of the movie and the rest of the pod race. I mean, it's cute and we loved it, but we were afraid that an audience would get bored with it. When I saw it for we went through the outtakes for the DVD, decided to put it back in the movie, or at least parts of it. You'll notice that on the outtakes on the DVD, it's actually longer than it is here, even though we added a few sequences back in. It's the great thing about a DVD is you can actually focus more on the movie than you focus on the first few weeks of the film being released, because you're always concerned that when the movie goes out there, people are going to be bored, they're not going to like it, and as a result, it doesn't work, and you lose everything. And that clouds your mind to keeping in a lot of little fun things that you like yourself, but you don't know whether they're, worth the extra length in the film, which risks the quality of the whole movie, or at least the success of it.
This scene was an especially difficult one to execute because of all the rig removal that had to take place underneath the pods. Those full-size pods were all supported on pipe rigs, and they had to be painted out in all of the shots.
One of the great things about these really wide shots where you see the audiences, all the background players weren't people, actually. They were Q-tips that were painted with little people's faces on them. It was a great idea that came up through the model shop at ILM, and I think it really was effective in showing how many people were in the arena.
Be safe. I will, Mom. I promise.
Here's Sebulba. You can notice the simulations happening on his, what we call his whiskers, as they move around. It really helps with the weight of the character and the feeling of it being a real creature in the shot. Nice bit of animation there as he plays with one of his whiskers. And then Patrick Bonneau, the animator, came up with this little gag where he pulls on his goggles, which I always really loved. That was never something that George asked for, but the animator came up with it, and it was just so believable, and it really gave you a bit of that of the understanding of that character that he loved it as soon as he saw it. One of my personal favorite characters out of the Star Wars universe is, of course, Jabba the Hutt. And a chance to create the new Jabba the Hutt for the Phantom Menace was something that I was very happy to be a part of. We went back to the original design of Jabba, thanks to Doug Chang's drawings, which made him a little bit younger, a little bit more svelte. He's completely computer-generated. Steve Rollins did all the animation on this. He's doing all that jiggle animation by hand. That's not simulated in this case. He's actually creating shapes that allow him to jiggle that flesh around and give us that math for Jabba's face.
I like this scene because with Jabba, because it was all constructed out of bits and pieces. The Darling women were shot at one point. Bib Fortuna was shot at another point. The set was a miniature. The guards were shot at a different point.
Hey, looks like
One of the more fun things about this pod race is that nothing's real. I mean, this is literally our little cast of characters on the in the little pod here, but the rest is just empty desert. And we did just shoot this outside so that we get a realistic effect. It had the wind and the weather and the quality that the rest of it had, but there's so little of this that's real. We had some pods out there on the set, but we didn't use them too much except for the pre-pod race. Once we got into the actual race part, everything's digital. In the original Star Wars, a scene like this would have been completely impossible, with this many extras and the vastness of this set. The complications of doing this kind of a race in a real environment, not in space. But to be able to create the environment, because you really have to have a very, very large set, or a miniature set. Or in this case, we were able to create it in a computer, which allows you to make it endless. In the old way of making movies, you just couldn't even think about doing something like this. You'd build a miniature set that would go on for a quarter of a mile in order to get these shots. And obviously that you just couldn't do something like that. Once I realized I had this digital power at my disposal, my first instinct how to use it was to do a race over an environment. I mean, I love speed and I love racing cars. And this is like the ultimate kid version of racing cars.
The announcers was originally a different concept. There were two actors with appliances on their faces that were going to be then comped in. Once we got into it, realized it was going to be really difficult. So at the last moment, they were redesigned and became completely computer generated.
Looks like Quadroneros was having engine trouble also.
This was an exercise in being able to do a lot of things that were just completely impossible to tell this movie. It also, besides being a fun action sequence, the point to this whole exercise was this is how Qui-Gon realizes that Anakin is special. Besides the fact that he has a high midichlorian count, it shows that he has a lot of agility and a lot of skills and an ability to see things before they happen and that sort of thing.
Sebulba, of course, is our arch enemy in the pod race, and we knew that from speaking to George that he was the great racer, and he was the guy who doesn't play fair, and he's the guy who knocks out all his competition. So we knew that about him in terms of his backstory. George also had him laughing almost the entire time. Takes great pleasure in knocking out his competitors. So we had a whole series of different laughs that we did for him.
I think the largest single task in Phantom Menace was the creation of the pod race sounds. I knew that we would have the race sequence since I was involved in its development from a storyboard through the pre-visualization process and ultimately to the editing of both the picture and sound for the sequence. I had hoped that the pod race would, for the most part, be a sound effects only sequence, that it would have very little dialogue and perhaps no music, and it would give me the opportunity to work with a full palette of just sound effects to create the action and the story and to control the tension, the ebb and flow of the race. And I did get that opportunity.
A lot of issues in here. Again, like the couplers coming apart and Ben Quadroneros' car coming apart, which are, make a lot of sense if you're from Tatooine and know how all this works, but I think for some of the audience it goes right past without them being able to follow it. But like all the Star Wars films, the more you sort of see it over and over again and the more you understand what's going on, after a while it'll make perfect sense because there is a logic to it all that's been put in there. If you know what power couplers are and how they work and what the dynamics of these racers are and all that sort of thing. Ben and I worked on the sound a lot to come up with sounds that were like real race cars, shifting gears and different sounds for different engines. Each engine has its own personality, very much like a regular Formula One or a sports car race where there's a lot of different personality in the cars just through the sounds.
I spent a great deal of my recording time gathering sounds for the pod race sequence, and although I had focused in the past on aircraft and rockets, this time around George Lucas had suggested that I really record a lot of high-speed automobiles and use those sounds as the basis for the pods. And so I hadn't done a lot of automobiles in my sound design career, so I set out gathering sounds of high-speed cars. Everything's from vintage Ferraris to Indy racers, as well as drag racers and souped-up trucks and motorcycles. Although I didn't restrict myself in the pod race sounds to just cars and automobiles, I recorded an electric toothbrush, which I modified into the sound of a pod racer. I synthesized some pulsing sounds for Sebulba's racer from, originally they were the sounds of a motorboat revving, and combined them with lots of electronic sounds to build up the texture for each racer. The real challenge of the sequence came in articulating the sound, but the race itself was, for the most part, principally sound effects, and so it was a chance for the sound effects to be both the music and the dialogue in the sequence and bring to the audience all the information they needed from the soundtrack during that whole sequence. And of course, I have to say, as a sound designer, I love the sequences like that because you get a chance to really be challenged with what can you do with abstract sound. You couldn't go out and record any racers anywhere for the pods. You'd have to invent it all as you went along. Not only did the racers have different voices, but they had to pass through different environments where they would go through a cave. Suddenly everything could be very echoed. And then they would pop out into the open where the sound is more diffused and quiet. And whereas the pods might kind of represent the steady notes in the scene. You get the punctuation of the Tusken Raiders shooting at them, or the individual components of explosions or revs kicking in and out of the different racers. In some sense, the crowd functions as music might in this sequence, because the crowd can bring with it a reaction which the listening audience will naturally pick up on.
And it was a real trick that I struggled with, to say, how can an 8-year-old boy here to be competent racing something like this? And so worked very hard to make it believable that Anakin really did have the ability, even though he was special, but that it was a believable idea that a kid this age could actually control a racing vehicle this intense. I mean, it's completely possible. I mean, there's lots of kids that are 8 and 9 years old that are dirt bike racing and go-kart racing and doing all kinds of things that are as intense as this. But you got to make the general audience believe that that's possible. Digital filmmaking definitely frees up your imagination, because I wouldn't even allow myself to think of a scene like this before, because it would just be, impossible to do. It was just, on all levels, financial and technical, you just couldn't accomplish this. And so it's fun to be able to do something that you kind of had dreamed about over the years. But even, only in fantasy, as you're sitting and writing a script, say, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do this? Wouldn't it be great if I could do that? But to finally be able to say, okay, I'm going to do it. And then see it come off as well as ILM was able to pull it off. Because, to me it looks sufficiently realistic that I believe I'm actually there.
I want to point out a mistake we made. We have one shot in here where we have Sebulba chasing Anakin, but there's no Sebulba in the cockpit. Right there. He's not actually in the cockpit. That's his headrest. But I figured we could get away with it.
Now they know.
Well, this whole moment where Anakin's engine catches fire and he falls behind was greatly extended after George showed it to some friends of his. He showed the scene in rough cut to Ron Howard and a bunch of his other friends. And Ron suggested that this moment where Anakin is struggling to try and get his engine reignited should be extended, so that you really feel the tension of him falling behind and hurry up. So we got about 10 shots added after that screening.
The guys at ILM did a great job of creating an environment for these things to pass through. I mean, it's a completely digital environment. But again, look as photorealistic as anything I could have ever shot if I'd have gone into some canyon somewhere.
This was a very difficult task to work this all out for the scene. But it was really about the only option. We looked at trying to shoot helicopter plates for this in some exotic locations, but they wouldn't really be exotic enough. I mean, no place on the Earth is quite as unusual and distinctive as what George had in mind for the terrain here. Also, even if you did find a location that was suitably exotic looking, you could never really fly a helicopter fast enough to get these plates.
It's a little tricky telling the story of how these two pods get hooked together and then break apart, and what Anakin does in terms of accelerating to cut them loose, and then at the same time it sets Sebulba off balance so that he loses control of his vehicle. It's again told visually rather than logically, so you get the sense of what's going on without actually knowing how it happens.
When Sebulba crashes at the end of the film, there's a moment of silence just before everything goes haywire with his engine, and that's a deliberate moment in the soundtrack. Once again, in order to make a contrast, we wanted to create a big crash and a big runaway sound of his engine. We preceded that with a moment where it's very quiet, so you'd hear it. And the idea, of course, when his pod gets banged by Anakin is that Sebulba's clutch disengages and his engine just goes up to an infinitely high RPMs and runs so high that it burns out and explodes. Therefore, the sound just rises in pitch very, very quickly. Standing to Jabba's right is his assistant and translator, Bib Fortuna, who in this case was played by none other than co-supervising sound editor Matthew Wood.
The scene where his mother congratulates and kisses him was in and out of the movie several times. I think it's ultimately a very important scene. Without it, it just didn't play very well. We needed to have closure on the event of the race, because the race was so dramatic that you sort of needed to have not just him being held up on the shoulders, but you needed actually more closure on that race than what we were able to give it with that one shot. The scene in the box after the race with Watto is one of my favorite scenes. I just love the views and the angles and everything. Again, you got to remember the only person in this whole scene really is Qui-Gon, and everything else is basically manufactured. So it's basically just Liam walking around on a blue screen.
I did kind of like that moment where the probe droid flies by just as Liam steps away from facing out, so that it doesn't get a chance to see him.
There's always many different things in the backgrounds out of focus, but that adds texture and depth to the shot. So George will always get us to add more characters, more creatures, more droids.
This is a scene that we shot. We thought we'd outsmart ourselves, so we had him put his little braid on the wrong side because I was going to flop the whole thing, and then it turned out I didn't do it, so I outsmarted myself.
Shot of Liam on the EOP was especially difficult to do. We needed to have some motion of it rocking back and forth when we shot the blue screen element of Liam. But then taking that and animating an EOP to move that same way under him and still have it look natural is extremely difficult.
Mom, we sold the pod. Look at how many we have.
My goodness, but that's so wonderful, Annie.
I've got 3 scenes here kind of back to back with Annie and his mother. Well, I have to say, besides saying goodbye to 3PO, but they're really primarily about Annie and his mother, which is quite a bit of time overall for a movie like this. But the relationship between Anakin and his mother is sort of crucial to what happens later on. And I wanted to give this moment of their parting sufficient emphasis. And to understand that it was Annie's choice really to go along and become a Jedi. In the beginning here, thinking that his mother was going to come along with him, and then later realizing that she wasn't, and realizing he was going to go off on his own, and making that as difficult as possible without going overboard. I've actually, when I shot this scene, there was quite a bit more crying and carrying on, and it sort of went emotionally, I think, over the top, melodramatically from what the rest of the movies are and what the style I'd created for myself. So I toned it down a bit, kept it, the idea going there, but didn't really go for what one would say the gold of hysteria and emotional, breakdown. It just seemed like too much when we began to watch it. It seemed out of place with the rest of the movie. Part of the challenge was to make the mother loving and kind and not reject him, support him in his need to go, but understanding that his only hope for any kind of future was to go off and become a Jedi, and that he had no real chance at life living on Tatooine, and make it painful for her to see him go, but at the same time make her strong enough to support him in his decision, without her falling apart. And I actually have it both ways. I have some takes that are a little less emotional in this, and I have some that are way more emotional. But you get yourself into a place in a movie where if you go too emotionally, and it makes everything too important, and puts you emotionally in a place where you can't get out of in terms of the rest of the story and the believability of the rest of the story. So the challenge always in these kind of films is to keep it kind of light and not too realistic, but still have it be believable. It's kind of a theme that reoccurs in episode 4, as I purposely develop themes and ideas and repeat them. It's very, very clear in the 2 trilogies that I'm putting the characters in pretty much the same situations, sometimes even using the same dialogue, so that the father and the son go through pretty much the same experience. Obviously, Anakin takes a different road than his son takes, so that at some of these turning points, they go the other way. But it's been set up for you to almost expect that they will go, that Luke will follow in his father's footsteps, because in a lot of these episodes they do follow each other, which leads to a subtle influence which gives the audience a little expectation. And say it's a musical idea. You have a lyrical refrain and you keep playing it over and over again in different, using different instrumentation, different octaves. It changes every time you rehear it. It's the same note played differently. I've tried to use that right from the very beginning when I did Star Wars. I was doing that. It really came out from something I was trying to do in THX, my first film I ever did, which was, instead of 3 acts, they're almost like 3 different movies. But each movie is telling the same story in a different way. I became fascinated with that idea of kind of visual jazz. It's like you go off on a riff on the same idea, and you just take the concept and you just interpret it differently visually. And there's a lot of that going on in these movies. I like the idea of cyclical motifs that keep recurring over and over and over again.
This was the very last sequence we shot in Tunisia on the very last day before we returned back for another 8 weeks of shooting at Leavesden. It was a very bittersweet day, very hot, but also a very emotional scene.
Anakin's position here when he leaves his mother is not that much different from when Obi-Wan asked him to come along with him on his adventure. And he decides he can't do it because he has all these obligations and he doesn't want to leave his home. And even though he's very anxious to leave, from the first part of the movie, it's the same kind of conflict. In this one, he takes the road. In the one with Luke, he decides not to take the road, but the inevitability of events force him to take the road. It's sort of like fate. And it would be the same thing here. But in this case, he didn't wait for fate to push him into this. He took the road. The scene where we first get a confrontation between a Jedi and a Sith, I wanted to be very abstract, not deal with it, because we have to, the end of the movie, the climax of the movie is the confrontation of these 2 characters. So I didn't want to give it away at this point. So I did it with a lot of swirling robes and flashing swords and kicking up a lot of dust, but not actually seeing the fight. This is really a little teaser of what we obviously are going to have at the end of the movie.
Initially, the fight was designed to have a lot of flying in it. I mean, essentially flying swordsmen. But along the way, that idea just didn't develop very well. And there was also a fight on the ramp of the spaceship as it took off over the desert. Qui-Gon jumped up to the ramp and was followed by Darth Maul. They actually fought a bit on the ramp before Qui-Gon cut the ramp, dropping Darth Maul to the desert below.
I'm not sure.
This is a little scene I toyed with over and over again, which is the introduction of Anakin to Obi-Wan. Obviously a very important moment, but I didn't want to overplay it, and I had this initial skepticism on Obi-Wan's part. Obi-Wan is not a big fan of Anakin's in this movie. That doesn't happen until later on.
One of the devices designed for Star Wars was the walking chair. This was done with the guy actually pushing it, and we had to remove all the mechanism underneath and replace this with the full computer graphic chair that was animated after the fact.
Including the marble floor. I remember you guys having to paint that, and I still can't imagine how difficult that would have been.
Yeah, all the patterns, you notice most of the floors are actually shiny as well, which meant that we had to reproduce not only the texture of the floor, but also the reflections and shadows. This was an extremely difficult shot, the actual panning over to see Jar Jar sleeping at the table, because the wide-angle anamorphic lenses cause so much distortion that if we put him on the plate, in the background scene, then his feet would slide relative to his body because everything was distorting. So this was one of the first challenges that we had to do, where we actually had to distort the computer graphics to match the distortion in the original play. The shots where we only see his feet are actually just
Ahmed in the suit.
Ahmed in the suit.
Those are not computer generated.
And even these scenes with the Queen and the young boy had to be done with a certain amount of splits, because once again, George wanted to change some of the timings or actual positions and things. So there's a couple in here where we had to do some manipulation after the fact.
What you really got here are 2 characters who are both off on a very difficult journey, both feeling very alone and comforting each other. Padme gets comfort from comforting Anakin, but it also gives her a chance to reflect a little bit on the problems she's having in terms of making decisions about what she's going to do about this situation of her people suffering. Her only hope at this point in the movie is to go to Coruscant, go to the Senate, and hope that justice will be done and her people will be freed. But I think underneath that, I've been trying to set up the fact that she's skeptical about whether this is all going to really work. I mean, she has to believe it because it's the only choice she has.
Coruscant, the planet completely covered by city. This was a really fun project to work on here. Trying to make something that's completely covered in buildings from orbit, but have that not look like the Death Star.
Coruscant, the entire planet is one big city. There's Chancellor Valorum's shuttle.
One of the elements of the landing Queen starship, which sound like backfiring of the engine, is in reality the cracking of the Hubbard Glacier near Yakutat, Alaska.
This is the first time we come to Coruscant. I was never able to do it before. I did it sort of in little bits and pieces, but I was never able to actually show the real city because it would have been too costly and too difficult. You know, when you're making a movie where the central action is happening on some capital planet, but you never get to go there, you only hear about it, is not a fun way to tell a story. But this way I could go right into the middle of it and see this whole aspect of the Republic, which is very crucial to the whole story because that's what it's about, is the Emperor coming to take over and how did a democracy turn into a dictatorship. One of our main characters, Anakin, is a little boy from Tatooine who has never been off-world, so to speak. And so I really wanted to tell this particular scene from the point of view of Anakin about the wonder of being in this amazing environment with all these very important people that he doesn't really understand what they're talking about or what's going on. And his only friend really is Padme. So he's using her as his anchor. There's conversations going on that are sort of above his head that we don't really know what they're talking about. A very elaborate environment, very different from Tatooine. And I wanted to really get the wonder of the Republic and the government and the giant city from Anakin's point of view, because I thought that would be the most interesting way to reveal this particular environment, which is, I guess in the end, probably one of the more glorious and impossible to do if you don't have digital technology. We also decided to add on, before we had this scene where we got to see a little bit of the planet in the taxi, and in an effort to shorten the movie, we pulled it out, and I put it back in again, because it does give a chance to see a little bit of the environment, a little bit of the city that, a planet that is a complete city, and show it off a little bit, wonder of it all.
There is no civility.
From then on, I very purposely kept Anakin sort of on the sidelines. The Gungan and the boy are always kind of, outside in the hallway somewhere. But that is the way it would be. They wouldn't be included in these kinds of meetings. They're kind of puzzled by what's going on. They're standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit a riff on the very first film where the story is told through the point of view of the droids, who were sort of the lowliest characters. And this one, I'm doing it through primarily the two Jedi. But then the secondary characters are also carrying a lot of the weight when the Jedi aren't around, which is basically Jar Jar and Anakin. Because the central story is ultimately the Queen's dilemma and the Queen's problem of the threat to her planet and her people, and how is she going to save them.
You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
This was the second thing we shot on the second day of principal photography.
If you'd been there on the day of the window, of course, it would have just been blue screen. The actors were told where they were, of course, in the script and where they were on what planet. But I don't think they had any idea of the expanse that was going to be outside the windows. I know from speaking to them after we saw the premiere, they were blown away by just shots like this that just go by, and the audience probably doesn't even think about them being effect shots because we've now seen the city from so many different angles, but they're still remarkable when you look at them.
Well, the Jedi Palace shot, the big establishing shot, was done shooting some models of the actual towers, and then the rest was done as a digital matte painting. So they photographed the set, and then George decided later that the windows that they built with blue screen behind them were too high. So we ended up lowering the windows. That meant tracing every character who's against a window, rotoscoping them, and cutting that section out. George also wanted to make this look as real as possible in terms of photography, so we actually overexposed the background. as if you're exposing for the interior. And we have lots and lots of flying vehicles outside, so we tried to create as many elements of those as possible. And each one we had to adjust the level of focus behind there, the depth of field, to relate to real-life things.
Scott, tell them about the light blooming around the characters.
Well, that was the other thing with the overexposure. We wanted to get a light wrap effect around them. So we'd done some photographic tests, and tried to reproduce the look there. So the light actually wraps around and creates that effect as if they're in front of a real bright background.
To me, that's the subtlety in the shot that just makes it really real.
Plot-wise, we're dealing with the insistence of Obi-Wan in taking on this young kid and training him, even though it's, in theory, the child should have been trained by Yoda until he was about 7 or 8 years old. And then when he was 7 or 8, he'd be given a Jedi. He'd become the Padawan learner to a Jedi. So here we're having Qui-Gon wanting to skip the early training and jump right to taking him on as his Padawan learner, which is controversial and ultimately the source of much of the problems that develop later on.
It's not here right now. Who is it?
Anakin Skywalker, to see Padme, Your Highness.
This is actually a scene that we added later. When I cut the film together and looked at it, I needed to set up something that explained where Padme was going to be during these next few scenes, because Padme disappears, because obviously Padme is the queen. So I needed to come up with some reason why we don't see Padme in this next series of scenes until we get back on the plane. One of the thematic issues here is how Palpatine becomes Chancellor, telling how he moved to the next level. And then when you see all of the films together, it'll all make a lot more sense. But this is kind of a very small thematic issue that transcends all 6 movies, as opposed to something that's actually neatly tied up in this particular movie. Although step 1 is that Palpatine becomes Chancellor. And you'll see in episode 2 that he then makes another step, and in episode 3, he makes another step.
It has now engulfed our entire planet in the oppression of the Trade Federation.
In the design of this scene, we really wanted to work on something that would show you that there are thousands and thousands of delegates into this government body, and that there would be some kind of unique way in which they were able to express themselves and carry on the government, but do it on a very grand scale, and came up with a sort of large stadium design with these little pods that move around inside it, which gives it a different look, but at the same time, the theme is very functional and realistic, even though it's completely not realistic.
Aided by the droid armies of the trade.
I object.
The Senate chamber represented a unique sound environment. The priority sound-wise was the dialogue, because what the characters are saying, it's very important to understand. Sounds of the pods had to be very subdued. Most of the sounds of the pods are made out of sounds I recorded in a refrigerator. The sounds of the motor turning on and off. So it's the motor's kind of muffled deep into the bowels of the refrigerator. They were echoed, and the different pods were pitched to slightly different sounds, so they wouldn't all blend together as the same noise. Just enough articulation to keep it alive and natural, as if you're really there, without calling a lot of attention to itself.
So the entire Senate sequence, some of the difficulty here was also dealing with the blue screen around the Queen's hair and little subtleties like that. When they go in front of the white glowing bars, we had to add all of that in and had to have that, once again, light wrap. And then all the cameras flying around are computer graphics.
Along with the blue screen people, we also put in some digital characters. If you look closely at the bottom of the screen, coming up, you're going to see the E.T. family in one of the pods. We also added some of the other pod racers into some of the shots. There's Gascano in one, there's Rats Tyrell in another one. So if you look closely down bottom left, those are the E.T.s down there.
The ETs are actually in a couple of shots. We put them in one shot, and George showed it to Stephen, and Stephen said, "Oh, they're not big enough." So George had us add them to another shot.
Tragedy continue.
One of the primary issues between this relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon is that this is establishing Obi-Wan as the kind of straight arrow, the center of the movie, and Qui-Gon as the rebel, as the one who's constantly sort of pushing the envelope. Which will switch itself in the next movie when, rather than having his master be the rebel, he has his Padawan learner become the rebel. I'm using Obi-Wan as sort of this centering device through all these movies, even as we get in with Luke and everybody else later on.
So here we're back inside the Jedi Palace, and once again trying to keep the same look and same tone, trying to do the color balance on all the foreground characters and make sure that the digital matte painting matched into all of that, created the same look. We also had to pay attention to which direction the camera was shooting to match the lighting and the sun in its position as well.
Doing this next trilogy and starting off with Phantom Menace gave me a chance to introduce things that are only hinted at in the later movies, 4, 5, and 6, which is the Jedi Council. How does it operate? You get to see, rather than just one or two fallen Jedi or half-trained Jedi or exiled Jedi, you actually get to see the Jedi in full operation, their temple that they operate out of. This was a challenge to make this all concrete and real.
This is one of our very first matte paintings of Coruscant from Yusei, and it really is spectacular. I mean, it just shows the city in such exquisite detail.
So a lot of times we rendered quite a range of different ships flying in the background. And you can also see that we have the head and tail lights and engine lights on most of the ships. And so those were added in as well. So we would make up these long loops of ships flying and add those into the specific scenes as required.
This scene was originally shot as a sunset scene, but then George decided that with the Jedi Council scene being sunset, and then the two Jedi out on the balcony being sunset, and then this scene being sunset was just too much. So he decided afterwards that we were going to make this just after the sun is set. So the whole tone of the scene went from this very warm, fiery orange sunset color to this much cooler, bluer scene.
I feel confident.
This scene begins to set up the relationship between the Gungans and the Queen. It's a setup for later on when she asks the Gungans for help. It's also moving along the plot of Palpatine becoming the Chancellor. And more importantly, it's the key scene where the Queen, rather than sitting passively by and watching all this stuff transpire, takes affirmative action and decides to go back to her planet and go back to her people. I've had this written several different ways, and at the same time I have several scenes that carry this idea further in terms of her, the conflict she's having between being passive and aggressive, and in terms of fighting and being peaceful. Because for her, it's a break of all of her principles to go back and fight. In this scene, she doesn't really intend to go back and fight, but she does intend to go back, which will lead to a fight, and she knows that. But she's still hoping that she can resolve it in some way that doesn't involve a war.
The Force is strong with him.
He is to be trained then?
No, he will not be trained.
No.
This was a little tricky in writing the script, in that I didn't want Anakin to become a Jedi yet, because I'm saving that for the end of the movie. But at the same time, I still had to have him tag along. And I was able to use really the device of the fact that Anakin had been put in Qui-Gon's care, and that he had promised his mother that he would take care of him, as a way of allowing them to take the boy along with him on this trek for the next third of the movie. But one of the difficulties of writing a script with lots and lots of characters is you have to be able to rationalize why everybody is along. If you have a film like Dirty Dozen, where you sort of establish they're all going out on a mission together and you gather them all up and they go, it's pretty easy. But when you got a situation like this where there isn't any mandate that they stay together, that they're there for transitory reasons that are constantly having to be renewed as the plot progresses, it becomes much more difficult to be able to get all the characters in on the act and take them along on whatever journey you're going on.
Go with the Queen to Naboo and discover the identity of this dark warrior. This is the clue we need to unravel the mystery of the Sith.
May the Force be with you.
As a little homage to Blade Runner, there's 2 Blade Runner spinners in the traffic stream here, but They ended up being pretty small. We didn't want them to show up too clearly. You can just barely see them. Near the beginning of Blade Runner, there was a shot where we're approaching the big police station building, and there's a Millennium Falcon that was turned into a building and placed in the skyline. So there was a Star Wars homage in Blade Runner, and so we decided to return the compliment.
This sequence was one of the very first massive blue screen sets that we had. All that existed was the ramp and this platform. It was very tough for the actors this first week to understand where they were and what they were supposed to be doing, how they were supposed to be reacting to everything around them.
We also get into this thing of what are midichlorians, how do they work, which advances a little bit of the story of the Force and how does the Force work and how do we come to know the Force, which is part of Anakin's training and learning to become a Jedi. We had to take the idea of the Force one step further. The midichlorians are kind of a side issue, not the sort of spiritual, metaphysical part of the Force, but the more practical, biological, physical part of the Force, or how we come to know the Force, which has to do really with the genetics of why some people are more tuned to the Force than others. One of the things that I'm doing in these films is to give it a little bit of reality, is to give the shots a kind of documentary feel where things float off the shot. I don't really put people in the center, and I let them sort of drift around in the frame a little bit more than you normally do in a movie. This is especially true in this scene here, as she goes up the ramp, where Jar Jar goes almost completely off the camera. And then as Anakin and R2 approach, well, Jar Jar's an animated character. I can put him wherever I want. But I purposely put him way off the side of the screen there. It just gives you the sense that it wasn't, just staged perfectly for the camera, that things are kind of caught. They aren't perfect. It actually happened, that Jar Jar was actually there. And I actually had to frame him, but I didn't, because he wasn't there.
This sequence took place at the National Palace of Caserta in Italy. It's the location that we shot at for 4 days when we left England.
Here we have another hologram shot that we photographed with the moving camera, so we tracked that camera motion in 3 dimensions, and then took the photography of the character against black, rotoscoped them out, and put them into that scene.
And those two control the pitch.
Within the queenship, once again, we did some manipulation too. Rob can probably describe some of the issues dealing with Jar Jar.
Sequence like this is pretty easy for Jar Jar. As you can see, he's just standing back there. But our challenge is to not upstage the live action, which is hard when you're dealing with Jar Jar. But the reality of him being composited in behind Ewan is something we have to deal with on every shot. But we always wanted to make it look like they're truly in the same space together.
I have one battleship on my scope.
It's a droid control ship.
They probably spotted them.
We haven't much time.
That's the Queen ship's landing, and these were shots that were also done. Were done in our very fast Saber compositing system. We had some stills that we had of the ship, and just sort of stuck them in back there and threw them out of focus, and did really quick matting with them to just sort of put it back there, and we could get these shots finaled in just a day or so, maybe 2 days. That traditionally would have taken a week or so to do, and they really were. It's just a great system. You saw off in the background in these shots, there was a lot of blue screen around them. I think in this case, their actors are in front of a blue screen, and we put the trees in there because they're supposed to be hiding in the woods. So these shots are sort of like nothing like they appear. More and more tweaking of shots here with the different smoke levels. Sometimes there was a lot of haze in the background. Other times there wasn't so much haze.
There's nobody there.
This shot leads us to the Gungan hideaway. Jar Jar has swum down to the Gungan city and nobody's there. So he decides to take the Jedi off to the secret meeting place. The meeting place itself was a interesting set of shots for us animators. We needed to be able to create a whole crowd of Gungans, the Caduceus that they ride on, Boss Nass, his council, and a series of birds and creatures that are running around in the sequence. Gungan children we added in running along beside the Caduceus. We used that tree as a wipe to the big miniature that we had. Those birds flying by are pico picos. Those are CG birds. There are Gungans in the trees, the scouts. There are children, there are mothers, there are fathers, there are animals. And of course, there's Jar Jar in the foreground here. Boss Nass is standing on a miniature head with his council members behind him.
This little sequence was shot in a forest just near Leavesden, about a mile away from the studio. Provided a great location for us with a lot of greenery. It's a very small area, but it worked extremely well for this sequence. We added, of course, miniature trees and a smoke to give it the atmosphere that it had, and added digital birds and everything else that you could. But it was a great little location for us.
Throughout the film, I have been playing with the fact earlier on that Qui-Gon knows that Padme is the queen. And he uses that, especially when they go on Tatooine. He taunts her a couple times. And in the pod race, he taunts her a couple times. Because he's just having fun with her, because he knows she's the queen. But the others around him don't. So he's been waiting for her to step forward and reveal herself. Anakin is completely surprised, but Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon aren't.
Great societies have always lived in peace.
The background in these shots is a model we made, probably about 20 feet square, and then different characters put into it. Even shots like this where the background's fuzzy and all, they're lit really well, and they just marry right in. It's amazing, this film, about how, I'd say 5 minutes into it, you totally buy the effects, and you're not even looking at them as special effects anymore, and you're looking just totally at the story.
In your hair.
I'll never forget one day we were in London. We were in the middle of a casting session, and this huge guy came in, this larger-than-life character. His name was Brian Blessed, and he started to regale us with stories about trying to climb Mount Everest, and he was such a charming, wonderful guy. We didn't have a part for him really at that moment, and then George finally came up with the idea, he'd be perfect for Boss Nass.
Maybe we are being friends.
And the hologram effect here, you're matching that to the original Star Wars.
Yes, this is a digital copy of the technique that was done originally. Originally, the material that was to appear as a hologram was run on a television monitor and then rephotographed. So we're adding the scan lines and roll bars and the flicker to try and make it look as though it were photographed off a television set.
Okay, here's a shot with nice clouds in it, and then we added the giant head into it, which is a model that we photographed.
They're here! Good, they made it.
This particular shot with Boss Nass arm in arm with Jar Jar is probably the most challenging shot we did in terms of animation. The reason it is because they're both wearing clothing, they're both computer graphics, so they have to bounce against each other, and computers like to pass things through each other. They're not really good at having things react and hit each other. We've got an acting performance going on, and we have a very long shot. So a shot like that would have probably taken us something like 8 weeks to animate.
This was particularly difficult. The background of this had no hills in it. So from a technical standpoint, they're under some trees, and it's English countryside, and there's probably a freeway back there. I can't remember. So we added those high rolling hills that are needed for the story, actually needed for later on when we get into the Gungan droid battle that's coming up. And they were just, we just cut and pasted them and repainted them and made shapes from out of the hills that would fit with the, fit with whatever shock we're trying to put them in.
Then we can enter
The sequence, too, was difficult, getting the blending and everything right on these composites to have these characters here like she's looking like she's right in front of the hills, but in fact she isn't. Very difficult matting problems here. These are all done in our quick compositing system, our Saber system, that got us these shots, very quickly composited.
The Gungans will be killed.
And some great animations going on here through this entire sequence, primarily with Boss Nass. He just has a great sense of weight when he walks, and really seems as as royal and proud as he's supposed to be, like he could possibly be the leader of this race. And it's hard, it's hard to look at this and think that Jar Jar is you could say, is of the same race even as Boss Nass. They always seem to me like they're sort of different things, but Boss is actually supposed to be a much, much older Gungan, and when you age, you kind of look like that. What do you think, Rob?
I think I'd buy it.
Buy it too? Okay.
This is a bit of a reveal to have the hologram walking along with them, and then you don't know how they're doing it. And you reveal that little walking machine that the hologram is standing on. And at the same time, you get to say, kill all.
Wipe them out. All of them.
This sequence has a little bit of a Japanese influence with the Gungans and their feathers on the back of their cadoos, but I wanted to give you the sense that they were leaving the safety of their fog-shrouded jungle and going into the plains where they're out in the open and vulnerable to attack.
So this is the beginning of the ground battle. This is where we have our 8,000 marching Gungans and cadoos and all sorts of characters going along here.
Needless to say, this was an enormous task to undertake for animation. We create a number of different walks for both the Gungans and their creatures. Think of thousands of particles moving across a plane, and each particle represents one particular character. And those particles have some intelligence of whether they're in close proximity to a fellow particle or whether they're in proximity to an enemy particle.
This was sort of based on, you could say a John Ford movie. It's what we were kind of thinking of, the Western outdoors, bright sunlight, beautiful clouds, and starting out with this wonderful green environment. These hills are just lovely and gorgeous and untouched. And by the end of the battle, they're totally scarred up and destroyed and pockmarked by all the bombs that have gone off. So keep an eye on that. As the sequence progresses, you'll see that.
So the courtyard was shot outdoors in England, but large sections of this were actually miniatures put in. So here we had to add in our different vehicles and things, and the tanks were photographed later.
Wasn't that you, Scott, driving the green speeder?
That was me driving that speeder there. We had some cameos by a number of the people here at ILM.
From a sound standpoint, these sequences are all very different. You have the fun of contrasting one type of sound texture with another. Sword fight has a certain sound, lightsabers being the prime component, and they have their own character. And then you cut to the ground battle, where you've got all the Gungan weapons and battle droid lasers and flak and force fields going on. And then you go to the space battle, where you've got the interceptors, the sound of Anakin's starfighter, and the control rooms on board the space station. Very much like a symphonic piece of music, you tend to develop the individual movements and then put them together as a whole. And there are themes and developments of themes within each one, both visually and from a sound design standpoint. And you get these statements of themes and then variations.
So here we've replaced most of the backgrounds, and in some cases they used shots that were meant for a different part of the sequence and getting different actions.
You can see that central rail running up the center of the room. They didn't build anything past that. So everything on the screen right is computer graphics.
The linchpin of this plot device of the droids being controlled by one source is based on the inability of the Nemoidians to give up control to the droids. Because if they could think for themselves and do things on their own, they would worry about having this giant army that might take them over. Because they would assume that their way of thinking, which is greedy and power-driven to consume and ravage, would be eventually the droids would do the same thing and take over them. Having grown up in the shadow of the Vietnam War, the issue of a primitive society confronting a technologically advanced society has fascinated me, because that was the main event that was going on really during my college years. And the fact that human determination and human spirit could overcome these vastly superior armies, actually I found to be rather inspiring as a human being. I think that is a theme, one of the main themes that's gone through all the Star Wars films. I like technology, I use technology, but at the same time, I understand the failings of technology, and you can't rely on technology for everything. So I have this dual nature in the movies of the friendly human good technology of R2 and 3PO and the evil technology of the battle droids and that sort of thing. I'm constantly playing with those two ends of the dilemma, but never really saying that one is better than the other. I'm just simply trying to promote the human spirit, even if it exists in a droid.
The same sort of bubble technology that was used in the underwater city is the bubble technology that they use for the force field shield. And when it's being used to protect them from weapons being fired at them, the force field shield works well. You see the bombs hitting them and the explosions, bounce right off and blow up. But again, just like in the underwater city, if you walk slowly, you can walk right through that field. And that's what the robots end up doing.
As things begin to build up toward the final confrontation and battles at the end of the movie, we approach what was the longest single editorial sequence that I had to deal with, which is the climactic battle at the end of the movie, which is really intercutting 4 separate sequences.
I'll never forget this day when we're shooting, because we had this incredible opening that reveals Ray Park as Darth Maul. And I remember the whole crew just shuddered. I mean, there was absolute silence as he looked up. Natalie just kind of walked away. She didn't know what to make of him. It was an awesome fight that we shot over a 2-day period, all at Leavesden Studios, on Stage A and Stage B. When he takes off his coat, it was just electric inside the stage.
So I've got 3 main pieces of action going on here, which is the sword fight, the Queen trying to get to her objective, which is the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, and the starship battle, of which Anakin plays a pivotal role.
Rolling droids were fun. I guess they later decided to we called them destroy droids. They were later called droidicars. But they were a lot of fun to animate because they were on 3 legs, and trying to figure out how to do a 3-legged walk was one of our challenges in the animation.
One of the trickier issues here was how to get Anakin up into the air in a kind of accidental, vaguely believable sort of way, which is one of the reasons why we had the pod race and everything, was to establish that he actually was pretty good at controlling mechanical devices and knowing how they work.
With Jake in the cockpit there, we had to actually manipulate quite a bit of the background, and we had to recreate the inside of the ship and shoot some inserts and things to make it look like he was actually moving through that environment. One of the problems that we had was they photographed these scenes with wide angles, which made some of those shots, like that last shot, a super wide angle where you'd see almost 180 degrees if you recreated it exactly as it was. So there is no generator room in the actual set. They built this foreground piece of floor and a little bit of the wall and some of the control panel things, but everything else was added after the fact. Here we've added the clothes on, of course, all the lightsabers. Like even that last shot where he jumped and flipped back, he lands on his feet, but he actually landed in a pad. So we had to remove the pad and create that with part CG feet. So a combination of things to get the type of action George wanted.
We had this ending cut lots of different ways. In a lot of my movies, I end them with the intercutting of 3 or 4 different events at the same time. So it came out of American Graffiti, where I was telling 4 stories and intercutting them, and now I've developed this idea of challenging myself to see how many stories I can tell simultaneously at the end of the movie. I think I slowed down on it a little bit, but this was very challenging in that there were, trying to get the balance right between the stories, and then coming up with little humorous pieces for Jar Jar to exploit the fact that he's a bumbler, but at the same time make his bumbling be the thing that helps turn the tide of the battle for the Gungans, even though they don't win the battle.
This is one of my favorite segments of the space battle. Not because I have a cameo in it, because they're really cool shots. This is me dying here.
Anakin and Jar Jar are both playing the same note in this, which is they're kind of bumbling their way through and coming out heroes.
The quality of the space battles from the first 3 pictures was so high that I really wanted to do something that at the very least lived up to that level of quality and took it a step further. So we were exploiting being able to have computer graphics as a tool to try and make some of the shots better, where you can see all the elements together in the frame as you're composing shots. There's little dramas playing out in the background of a lot of those shots. If you really look, you can see one ship pursuing another, firing and then hitting it. There's a lot of specific animated things happening in the backgrounds.
No, we're in trouble.
These were a few tricky shots here to make them look correct. We had to also reproduce a similar look to the original Star Wars movies, just in terms of the way the laser blast and things looked.
Satan gun.
The actual take of those guys going up the side of the building, we did do several takes. We never did get it right, actually, because one of the guys wasn't pulled up fast enough, you can see there. So we had to sort of optically make him go faster in the next shot to catch up with the other ones. But that was as close as we came to actually making it work. But there was always somebody who didn't get pulled up.
And this shot right here is made up of quite a number of different pieces. They only shot that little section where the people are walking. Everything else is a digital matte painting. And now we're into the generator room with the battle. So they're just against a blue screen. We had to slip the sync on those two guys so that his foot would actually hit. And we painted a few frames of the foot hitting Obi-Wan's face.
And the only thing they shot there for you, Scott, right, was just those little walkways, just a little bit of a walkway?
Just a section of the walkway. And in some cases, we ended up rotoing around those. They were so shiny that it was all reflecting the blue screen. So everything behind all those power-generated things, those were done with the special software that we wrote here, along with particle systems. So all of those energy beams and things, we had to work out the timings, and in many cases, George decided later, well, I actually want those closed at this point or turned on at this other point. So we would end up having to either create those with computer graphics in some cases, or just split that and change the timing. And this was shot after the fact as an insert, just to make it clear to people that this was a dangerous doorway here, that you couldn't just walk through these energy fields.
And these doors only went up about halfway. You had to extend those.
Right. Yeah, and like Obi-Wan in the background there, he was all added later.
In the sequence with Jar Jar, I wanted to have this comedy element going in the middle of the battle. The comedy of Buster Keaton was an inspiration for some of this, especially the sequence here where he hides under the trailer full of energy balls and then pulls them down and they chase him down the hillside. There was a sequence with this in a Buster Keaton movie with barrels where he was chased down a hill with barrels. And then we added the idea that they would, when they hit the tanks, they would blow up the tanks, and then it would sort of turn the tide of the battle.
The explosions in this, the smoke blowing up in the air, the explosions on the ground, those are all shot as separate elements against blue screen, outdoors, and then put into the shots. So that wherever, again, we wanted to, we could design primarily first to tell the story. So that you saw the primary characters from the best point of view telling what the story is, like Jar Jar running away from the rolling balls. You had to see Jar Jar, you had to see the balls, whatever. Then we would pick a good background for that to show that action. Then we would populate it with characters fleeing or attacking, and then we would put the explosions in to fill in the other parts of the frame. It was just so exciting. I can't tell you how exciting it was to just see the storyboards on this, to have, like 200 shots with 5,000 Gungan fighting 5,000 droids, and the whole thing being synthetic and the whole thing being in bright sunlight, like a real battle scene. Boy, you don't get opportunities like that very often.
You get to a point in the film, always in a film, where everything gets very, very dark. It looks like the bad guys are going to win. And when you got all these stories going on, I have to have it look like Anakin's going to be destroyed, the Jedi are going to be destroyed, the Queen has been captured, and the Gungans have been captured. So there's a point here where all the stories come together at their blackest moment, where everybody's captured, everybody's getting killed, everything's very dark, and it doesn't look like they're going to get out of it. That's a tradition of serials, all kinds of Saturday matinee adventures. Down toward the end here, where everything is very bleak, and where everybody's at their lowest moment, I purposely started to intermesh the images in a way that would create greater tension, like in this sequence here where the droids are coming after Anakin. Anakin's trapped, he's about to be killed. Immediately cut to a giant close-up of Darth Maul. He's almost looking at Anakin, and then you realize you're in the next scene, and it's these things. But it's trying to almost confuse and meld together the various sequences that are in various different places, so that you get a sense that they're all in trouble and they're all very connected. One of the most difficult parts of this end was to contrive a situation where I could separate Obi-Wan from Qui-Gon. because I had to have a situation where Qui-Gon could get trapped behind the gates later on, and Obi-Wan could watch while he was killed, but that there wasn't anything he could do about it. There's a tricky thing going on here too, which is that I have to build the sword fight to the end with Obi-Wan, but I still wanted to get a really good fight with Liam. We will see a lot of these sequences here end with a close-up of a person looking, so they're almost looking into the next sequence, so that it blends those sequences together. They're very, very soft transitions.
And here we are at the final section of what we call the ground battle. We have all the droids that haven't made it being tossed into a pile by a small other little droid. And we have the Gungans all being rounded up. We do have Gungans in the background who are injured. There's some that are limping. There's some that are hurt. And then we have our two heroes here, Tarpals and Jar Jar.
Lighting was a very critical thing to us. We would try to get references from the actual live-action plate, and it was critical that all the angles and amount of light match and all the reflections. We tend to think of it almost, take it for granted now.
This shot, when the droids are running between the Neimoidians, is one of my favorites because you can see the tight interaction between the animation and the compositing, where you can see that there's shadows being cast on the computer-generated droids as they run through the live action. What really makes it feel like they're in the same space together.
Cutting on this sequence continued right up until the end of the release of the movie. Within the last week prior to the delivery of the film, there were certain little things being done editorially in this sequence to get everything to connect together just right. There was a shot added at the very end of Obi-Wan turning his sword on, which hadn't been there, but was needed really to make the logic of the final intercutting just before he kills Darth Maul make more sense dramatically.
This was a fun sword fight with Ewan and Rey, because they were really into it, and they were very much out to prove who was the better swordsman, and they were very much challenging each other, which made for very exhausting shooting, but very exciting. They would finish this, and their swords would almost be bent in half. They were hitting each other so hard. Again, a kind of recurring theme of Obi-Wan. He falls over the ridge earlier, falls over the ridge here, copying kind of what happens in Empire Strikes Back with Luke in the same kind of sword fight with the Sith falling, going over the edge before he gets his hand cut off. In this case, we twist it at the end. Instead of the Sith cutting off the hand of the Jedi cuts the Sith in half.
So when Anakin fires at the reactor core, the reactor core itself is a miniature, where each one of the little reactors is about 2.5 or 3 feet across. But then we switch over to kind of a different technique here for the remainder of these blowing up shots. The shots inside the hangar where we see these explosions, those are explosions that were shot separate and then composited into the computer graphics. That, for example, all those explosions on the outside of the Neimoidian ship, that's the motion control model of the ship, which was a large model, but it was only about 8 feet across. The explosions on it are on the order of 6 to 8 feet across, so they were shot separate to be comped in. We didn't shoot with any glass in the canopy, so all the apparent glass, which is mostly the reflection.
All the reflections and little smudge marks, that's all put in.
That was all comped in later. The sphere that was the center part of the motion control model is about 18 to 24 inches across, and it was a nice model. We didn't want to blow it up, so we built a 4 foot across, just spherical shape, and we blew that up. And if you look very closely, well, you probably can't see any evidence of it because I think we did a good job of hiding the transition, but we switched from the motion control model to the pyro explosion just as the explosion is starting to come out of the cracks.
And again, intercutting these whole sequences and who succeeded and in what order, this has all been changed around several different times. It seems very obvious now, but when you have 4 endings, basically, you have to figure out which ending is the most important ending and save that one for last, which is this one and the most shocking, really, which is Darth Maul getting cut in half. And you make that the last ending.
So here he's been cut in half, and this was one of those tricky shots to make it look correct and to do a focus pull and have him bounce off the walls correctly.
Plot-wise, the whole issue here is that Obi-Wan has to take over the training of the kid, because that's the theme that goes through all the rest of the movies. I mean, that haunts him for the next 6 movies.
Promise me you won't train the boy. Master. He is the chosen one. He will bring balance. Train him.
The ship is actually a physical model that we shot motion control. We had to add the shadows later. Then we have a number of blue screen people here that were shot in England, combined with blue screen people that we photographed here at ILM. And you can see we've got moving cameras and the rest of it. And all of these backgrounds are the miniature sets behind them. There is no location that they were shooting at. The ground was the only thing that they actually had there.
This scene here is the one that did take place in the Queen's Chamber, but I decided to take it out of there and then move it down later here because, as it turned out, we needed a little bit more time after the movie to settle down, and we needed a little bit more finality to the Neimoidians being sent off to prison or wherever they're going. And I also wanted to bring Palpatine back, but I really wanted to finish that story, and I wanted to have this little moment where he tells Anakin that he's going to be paying more attention to him in the future.
And so here we have behind them, we have Ben Burt, along with Martin Smith, our editor, and we have Rick McCallum, the producer on the movie. And this was our first digital Yoda.
I'd known from when I'd seen the original trilogy and read about what George had said about the movies that he'd always wanted to see Yoda walking, not encumbered by wires and puppeteer. He wanted him to be able to move around. Frank Oz has always done such a fantastic job of the puppet, but to have the chance to actually animate him walking and knowing how important that was to George was really a triumph for us, and I'm very happy how that shot turned out.
The scene with Yoda was another scene that got added. When we saw it all put together, we really needed to spell out that Obi-Wan was going to take over the training. Before, it was in the scene, in Qui-Gon's death scene, and it just seemed out of place in that context of the funeral and all those kinds of things. We had the piece where Obi-Wan tells Anakin that he's going to take over his training, but we never saw this scene where he was given the assignment, and ultimately it really needed this. The end of the last film is Anakin at a funeral pyre, just like Qui-Gon is here. So I wanted to keep those motifs, again, things to harken back to other things that have been going on in the movie. We then have this moment, which is very important, where Obi-Wan commits and tells Anakin that he's going to train him, because that's where the rest of the movies go.
The Council have granted me permission to train you. You will be a Jedi. I promise.
We have our digital characters, so we have the same flickering light on them. And now we've added flames to the Qui-Gon model.
How do you match the flickering light, Scott?
Basically, we have some programs so we can say, okay, look at this part of the scene with the flickering light on that wall and adjust the brightness and color of the CG characters the same way.
There's a very subtle thing going on here through the next 2 movies of Palpatine's involvement with Anakin, which isn't on screen. It's all sort of hinted at.
This was the very last shot that ILM delivered to us just 4 weeks before the film was released. It was a very, very difficult shot to do, a whole difficult sequence to do, but I think Rob and Scott and everybody pulled it off brilliantly. It was a fitting end to an amazing 5-year experience of trying to put together one of the most complicated films ever made. We had probably 600 people involved at ILM and 600 people with construction in the UK making the film. It just was an amazing moment for all of us.
Traditionally in Star Wars, just with the title sequence in the beginning and the way that is so structured, I always have a musical sequence at the end. It ends in some kind of a celebration or some kind of an emotional event that is purely musical in nature, has no dialogue. So usually the last 2 minutes of the film are musical, and they then iris into the end titles. Very structured. Trying to keep a certain structure and a certain motif going through all the movies. So they all start the same way, they all end the same way, and they have these recurring themes and these cycles of events and incidents that sort of reverberate through all the movies in different ways.